In the quiet solitude of our own consciousness, we experience the world through a vessel of remarkable complexity. This body, this intricate machine of flesh and bone, is our only home, the lens through which we perceive all of reality. It is a universe unto itself, a bustling, silent metropolis of trillions of cells, each performing its function in a grand, coordinated, and largely unconscious ballet. For most of our lives, we inhabit this vessel without a thought, trusting in its silent, autonomous workings. But then, one day, the rhythm changes. A strange fatigue settles in our limbs. A fever warms our skin. A pain, sharp or dull, announces itself without invitation. The silent background hum of our own biology suddenly becomes a loud, insistent and troubling noise. This is the moment we encounter sickness. For all of human history, this experience, the sudden or gradual failure of the body's silent harmony, has been one of our most fundamental challenges. It is a profound and deeply personal crisis, a confrontation with our own fragility and mortality. But the story of sickness is not just a story of individual suffering. It is also the story of one of our species' greatest and most noble collective endeavours, the long, patient and often fumbling journey towards healing. It is a story that stretches back into the mists of deep time, long before the written word, to the very dawn of our consciousness. It is the story of our enduring refusal to simply accept suffering as fate, our relentless, multi-generational quest to understand the nature of our own bodies and the invisible forces that can bring them to ruin. Tonight, we will embark on a quiet journey through this history. We will not focus on the frantic battles or the terrifying plagues, but on the slow, patient evolution of human thought. We will see how our understanding of sickness has been a mirror, reflecting our deepest beliefs about the world, about the gods, and about our own place in the cosmos. We will begin in a world of spirits and magic, where sickness was an invisible arrow fired by an angry god. We will travel to the ancient world of Greece, where the body was a microcosm of the universe, a delicate balance of internal humours. We will witness the quiet courage of the first anatomists who dared to look inside the forbidden temple of the human body. Then, our journey will turn inward, into the universe of the cell, the gene, and the mind. We will peer through the first microscopes, discover the germ theory of disease, and unravel the beautiful, intricate code of our own DNA. This is not just a history of medicine, it is a history of human empathy, of our timeless collective impulse to reach out and care for one another. It is the story of how we learned, over tens of thousands of years, to listen to the whispers of our own bodies, to decode the science of our own sickness, and to begin the long, slow, and never-ending process of healing ourselves. Let us begin our story not with a disease, not with a plague or a fever, but with a simple, physical wound. Let us travel back in time, far back, into the deep, unwritten history of our species, to a time perhaps 100,000 years ago. We find ourselves in a small nomadic group of early humans living a precarious existence on the vast plains of Africa. Their world is one of immediate physical reality. It is a world of stone tools, of fire, of the hunt, and of the constant, pressing need for survival. Their understanding of the world is woven from observation, from instinct, and from a deep spiritual connection to the natural forces that surround them. One day, a member of this group, perhaps a hunter, is injured. It could be a fall from a rock, the gash from a wild animal's claw, or a deep cut from a sharpened flint tool. The skin, the body's first and most important line of defense, is broken. Blood flows. Pain, sharp and immediate, floods the hunter's awareness. The wound is a raw, physical fact, a stark and undeniable disruption of the body's integrity. In a world governed by the harsh laws of nature, such a wound is often a death sentence. An animal in the wild, seriously injured, is quickly abandoned by its pack, left to die alone or to be picked off by predators. Survival of the fittest is a brutal and unsentimental calculus. But here, in this small community of early humans, something different happens. The injured hunter is not abandoned. Instead, another member of the group, perhaps a mate, a sibling, or simply a fellow human, approaches. They do not see the wound merely as a sign of weakness, a liability to the group. They see it as a source of suffering in another being, a being like themselves. And in that moment of recognition, a new and powerful impulse is born, an impulse that will come to define our species, the impulse to care. This first act of healing is not based on science or on any formal knowledge. It is an act of pure, unadorned empathy. The caregiver may do something simple, something instinctual. They might use a clean leaf to wipe away the blood. They might press on the wound to staunch the bleeding. They might fetch cool water from a stream to clean the gash. They might find a specific type of moss or a chewed-up plant pulp, something they have observed animals using, or something passed down through generations of quiet oral tradition, and apply it to the wound as a poultice. They might gently bind the wound with a strip of animal hide or a strong plant fibre. These actions may or may not be medically effective in a modern sense. The leaf might introduce as much dirt as it removes. The poultice might have no real antiseptic properties. But the significance of the act transcends its practical outcome. The true healing that is happening here is not just the closing of a physical wound, but the closing of a social one. The caregiver is communicating a powerful non-verbal message. You're not alone in your suffering. Your life has value to me and to the group. We will not abandon you. This act of tending, of caregiving, strengthens the social bonds that are the true key to our species' survival. It transforms a group of competing individuals into a cooperative, supportive community. Let us contemplate the scene. The injured hunter lies in the flickering light of the communal fire, the pain, a constant throbbing presence. The caregiver sits patiently beside them, reapplying a poultice, offering a sip of water, or simply providing a quiet, reassuring presence. This is a scene of profound stillness and connection. It is the birth of the patient-caregiver relationship, the foundational dyad of all future medicine. In this simple, prehistoric act, we can see the seeds of everything that is to come: the nurse's comforting hand, the surgeon's steady focus, the scientist's patient search for a cure. All of it begins here, with the simple, human-to-human transmission of empathy. Archaeological evidence gives a silent, powerful testimony to these ancient acts of care. We have found the fossilized remains of individuals who survived for years with debilitating injuries that would have made it impossible for them to hunt, to gather food, or to care for themselves. The famous Old Man of Shanidar, a Neanderthal skeleton found in modern-day Iraq, shows evidence of a crushed eye socket that would have left him partially blind, a withered arm, and severe arthritis. Yet he lived to an old age, long after suffering these injuries. He could not have survived without the long-term, dedicated care of his group. They must have fed him, protected him, and guided him for years. These ancient bones are not just fossils. They are monuments to a prehistoric compassion. They are the physical proof that our ancestors chose to care for their sick and their wounded, to invest their collective energy not just in the strong but in the vulnerable. This first act of healing, then, is a pivotal moment in the story of humanity. It marks a departure from the purely biological imperative of individual survival and the beginning of a cultural imperative of collective care. It is the moment we began to fight back, not just against the external threats of predators and starvation, but against the internal threats of injury and sickness. It was a fight that began not with a weapon, but with a gentle hand. It was a fight waged not for dominance, but for the preservation of a fellow being. Before there was any science of sickness, there was the art of care, and this art, this fundamental empathetic impulse to lessen the suffering of another, remains the deep, unchanging and essential heart of all human healing. Let us now journey deeper into the world of our ancient ancestors, into a time when the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was not a line, but a permeable, shimmering veil. For these early humans, the world was not a collection of inert matter governed by impersonal laws. It was a living, breathing, and sentient place, filled with intention, with meaning, and with a vast, unseen population of spirits, gods, and ancestors. The rustle of leaves in the wind was not just air in motion, it was the whisper of a spirit. The flash of lightning was not just an electrical discharge, it was the anger of a sky god. Every event, from the success of a hunt to the failure of a crop, had a why behind it, a purpose, a will. And it was within this enchanted, animate cosmos that our ancestors first tried to answer the terrifying question, why do we get sick? In a world suffused with intention, sickness could not be a random biological accident. It too had to have a why. It had to be an event with a cause and a purpose, an act perpetrated by an unseen agent. Sickness was an intrusion, a violation. It was an invisible arrow fired from the spirit world. It was a malevolent entity, a demon, that had taken up residence in the body, consuming one's life force from within. It was a punishment from an offended god or an ancestral spirit, a just retribution for a broken taboo, a forgotten ritual, or a disrespectful act. Or perhaps it was the result of a curse, a work of malicious magic sent by a rival or an enemy. The cause of sickness was not to be found in the body itself, but in the intricate, invisible web of social and spiritual relationships that surrounded the individual. To fall ill was to be in a state of spiritual crisis. The fever, the pain, the weakness, these were not just symptoms of a physical ailment. They were the signs of a spiritual battle being waged within one's own flesh. The body was the battlefield. This understanding, while scientifically incorrect, was a powerful and necessary psychological tool. It took the terrifying, random, and meaningless experience of suffering and gave it a narrative. It gave it a cause, an antagonist, and therefore the possibility of a solution. If sickness was a spiritual attack, then it could be fought with spiritual weapons. If it was a punishment, then amends could be made. The situation was not hopeless. There was something that could be done. This is the world that gave rise to the first specialized healer, the shaman. The shaman was a unique and powerful figure in the community, a man or woman who could, through trance, through ritual, through deep knowledge of the spirit world, travel across the veil. They were the mediators between the visible and the invisible realms. When a person fell sick, it was the shaman who was called upon to diagnose the spiritual cause of the ailment. Their work was not to examine the body, but to read the soul. They would enter a trance state, perhaps aided by rhythmic drumming, by chanting, or by the ingestion of hallucinogenic plants. In this altered state of consciousness, they would journey into the spirit world to discover the source of the sickness. Did the patient's soul become lost or stolen? The shaman would have to journey to find it and bring it back. Had a curse been placed upon the patient? The shaman would have to identify the source of the curse and perform a counter-ritual to break its power. Had a malevolent spirit entered the body? The shaman would have to perform a form of exorcism, a dramatic and often frightening ritual designed to drive the entity out, using sacred objects, smoke, or incantations. Had a god or an ancestor been offended? The shaman would have to determine the nature of the offense and prescribe the correct ritual of apology or sacrifice to appease the angered spirit and restore harmony. The healing rituals themselves were powerful, multi-sensory, and deeply communal events. The entire community might gather around the sick person, their collective energy focused on the act of healing. The shaman would chant, sing, and dance, their movements telling the story of the spiritual battle they were waging on the patient's behalf. They would use sacred objects, feathers, crystals, animal bones, each believed to hold a specific power. They would burn sacred herbs, the smoke carrying their prayers to the spirit world and cleansing the sick person's aura. The patient was not a passive recipient of treatment. They were an active participant in a powerful psychological drama. The effectiveness of these rituals cannot be measured by the standards of modern medicine, but their power was undeniable. This was the birth of the placebo effect, the powerful and still mysterious phenomenon in which a person's belief in a treatment can itself produce a real, physiological healing response. The shaman's ritual was a powerful act of meaning-making. It provided the sick person with a coherent explanation for their suffering. It demonstrated in a dramatic and tangible way that their community cared for them and was actively fighting for their well-being. It mobilized the patient's own will to live, their own inner resources to participate in the fight. It gave them a sense of agency and hope in a situation that might otherwise feel hopeless. And in many cases, this powerful combination of psychological, social, and emotional support was enough to tip the balance, to allow the body's own natural healing processes to overcome the illness. To contemplate this world is to see the deep, ancient roots of our need for meaning in the face of suffering. It is to understand that for thousands of years, medicine was not a science, but a story. It was a story of a battle between invisible forces, a story of transgression and redemption, of harmony and disharmony. The shaman was not a doctor. They were a storyteller, a spiritual guide, and a master of human psychology. They were the first to recognize that healing the body often requires healing the mind, and that the health of the individual is inseparable from the health of their spiritual and social world. The invisible arrows of sickness were met with the invisible power of belief, and in that ancient spiritual battle, the foundations of human healing were laid. While the shaman waged war in the spirit world, another quieter form of healing was taking place, one rooted not in the drama of the supernatural but in the patient, careful observation of the physical world. This was the dawn of herbalism, the slow, multi-generational discovery of the medicinal properties of plants. It was a science before the name existed, a form of knowledge gathered not through grand theories, but through thousands of years of intimate trial-and-error interaction with the local environment. It was a medicine born from listening to the subtle, silent whispers of the earth. Let us return to our ancient ancestors, living in close daily contact with the natural world. Their survival depended on a deep and intricate knowledge of their surroundings. They knew which plants were good to eat, which were poisonous, and which had other useful properties. This knowledge was not academic. It was a matter of life and death, accumulated over countless generations and passed down as a sacred trust. A mother would teach her daughter which berries to gather, a father would teach his son which mushrooms to avoid. The entire community was a living library of ecological knowledge. Within this vast body of knowledge, certain plants would have been observed to have specific physiological effects. Perhaps someone with a fever was given a tea made from the bark of a particular tree, and the fever broke. Perhaps a warrior chewed the leaves of a certain plant, and the pain from his wounds seemed to lessen. Perhaps a child with an upset stomach was given a specific root to chew, and their discomfort eased. These were small, isolated observations, moments of correlation between a plant and an effect. One single observation might be a coincidence, but when the same observation was made again, and then again, by different people at different times, a pattern would begin to emerge. A piece of knowledge would begin to crystallize. This was a slow and often dangerous process. For every beneficial plant discovered, there were likely many others that were ineffective, or worse, harmful. The first herbalists were, in a sense, their own experimental subjects. They were taking a risk, tasting a new leaf, brewing a new tea, and carefully observing the effects on their own bodies. This was a science of the self, a deeply personal and embodied form of inquiry. The knowledge gained was precious, paid for with personal experience, and it would have been carefully guarded and passed down to the next generation. Over time, this knowledge would have become more sophisticated. The ancient herbalists would have learned not just which plant to use, but which part of the plant: the leaf, the root, the flower, the bark. They would have learned the best time of the year to harvest it, when its medicinal properties were at their peak. They would have learned the best way to prepare it, as a tea, as a poultice, as a dried powder. This was a complex and nuanced pharmacology, developed without any knowledge of the underlying chemistry. We can see a deep wisdom in their methods. They often observed the behavior of animals. Which plants did a sick animal seek out to eat? Which leaves did an animal with a wound rub against? This zoopharmacognosy, as it is now called, was a way of learning from the older, more instinctual knowledge of the other creatures with whom they shared the land. They were learning from the collective wisdom of the ecosystem itself. The role of the herbalist was often, though not exclusively, filled by the women of the community. While the men were often focused on the hunt, the women were the primary gatherers. They spent their days interacting with the plant world, their hands in the soil, their eyes trained to notice the subtle differences between one leaf and another. They were the keepers of this quiet, patient, and life-sustaining knowledge. The image of the wise woman, the village healer with her deep knowledge of herbs and remedies, is an archetype that has its roots in this deep prehistoric reality. This herbal knowledge was not seen as separate from the spiritual worldview of the time. It was deeply integrated with it. A plant was not just a collection of chemicals, it too had a spirit, a life force. The act of harvesting a plant was a sacred one, often accompanied by a prayer or an offering of thanks to the plant's spirit. The healing power of the herb was not just a chemical reaction, it was a gift from the spirit of the plant, a transfer of its life force to the sick person. The shaman might identify the spiritual cause of the illness, and the herbalist would then provide the physical medicine, the specific plant spirit, needed to restore balance. The two forms of healing were two sides of the same coin. The legacy of this ancient knowledge is still with us today, a quiet green thread running through the entire history of medicine. Many of our most powerful modern drugs have their origins in these ancient plant remedies. Aspirin, the world's most widely used pain reliever, is a synthetic version of salicin, a compound found in the bark of the willow tree, which was used as a pain and fever reducer for thousands of years by cultures around the world. Quinine, the first effective treatment for malaria, comes from the bark of the cinchona tree, first used by the indigenous peoples of Peru. Morphine, one of our most powerful painkillers, is derived from the opium poppy, a plant whose medicinal use dates back to at least 3400 BC. To contemplate the dawn of herbalism is to appreciate a different way of knowing, a way of knowing that is slow, patient, intuitive, and deeply connected to the earth. It is a reminder that the natural world is not just a resource to be exploited, but a vast and ancient library of chemical and biological wisdom. The first herbalists were the first true scientists of medicine. They did not have laboratories or microscopes, but they had keen eyes, a willingness to experiment, and a deep, abiding respect for the living world around them. They were the first to listen to the whispers of the earth, and in those whispers they found the first real, tangible hope for the healing of the human body. Let us now travel forward in time, from the enchanted, spirit-filled world of our deep ancestors to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Greece around the 5th century BC. Here, in the bustling city-states of a new and vibrant civilization, a profound intellectual revolution was taking place. A new kind of thinker, the philosopher, was beginning to look at the world in a different way. They were no longer content with purely spiritual or mythological explanations. They were searching for rational, natural causes, for underlying principles and patterns that could explain the workings of the cosmos. And as they turned this new, rational gaze upon the human body, they gave birth to a new kind of medicine, a medicine based not on appeasing gods, but on understanding nature. This was the dawn of humoral theory, a beautiful, elegant, and profoundly influential system of thought that would dominate Western medicine for over 2,000 years. At the heart of this new medicine was a simple, powerful, and deeply intuitive idea. The human body is a microcosm, a small-scale reflection of the larger universe, the macrocosm. The same fundamental principles that govern the heavens and the earth must also govern the human body. The ancient Greeks believed the world was composed of 4 essential elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Each of these elements was associated with specific qualities. Earth was cold and dry, water was cold and wet, air was hot and wet, and fire was hot and dry. It seemed only logical, then, that the human body must also be composed of 4 corresponding fundamental fluids, or humours. These 4 humours were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was believed to be produced by a specific organ and to possess the qualities of its corresponding element. Blood, associated with air, was hot and wet. Phlegm, associated with water, was cold and wet. Yellow bile, produced by the liver and associated with fire, was hot and dry. And black bile, a mysterious and hypothetical substance perhaps associated with the spleen, was linked to earth and was cold and dry. A healthy person was someone in whom these 4 internal rivers flowed in perfect balance and harmony. Their humours were in the correct proportion, their qualities properly mixed. Health was a state of equilibrium, a state of inner balance that mirrored the harmony of the cosmos. Sickness, therefore, was no longer seen as a spiritual intrusion, but as a natural internal event, an imbalance of the humours. This was a revolutionary shift in thinking. The cause of disease was moved from the external supernatural world to the internal physical world of the body itself. If a person had too much or too little of a particular humour, or if one of the humours became corrupted or separated from the others, the body's natural harmony would be disrupted and illness would result. The specific nature of the illness depended on which humour was out of balance. A person with too much phlegm, for example, might suffer from a cold or a lung disease, their body exhibiting the cold and wet qualities of that humour. A person with an excess of yellow bile might be choleric, suffering from jaundice, vomiting, and an angry, irritable temperament, reflecting the hot and dry nature of that humour. An excess of black bile could lead to melancholy, a state of profound sadness and depression, a condition as cold and dark as the earth itself. The role of the physician, most famously embodied by Hippocrates and his followers, was to be a facilitator of nature's own healing power, The physician's first and most important task was diagnosis. This was not a diagnosis of a specific named disease, but a diagnosis of the patient's unique humoral imbalance. The physician would carefully observe the patient, using all their senses. They would look at the colour of their skin, their tongue, and their eyes. They would listen to the sound of their breathing. They would feel the temperature of their skin. They would even smell and taste the patient's urine, sweat, and blood, as these were believed to be direct expressions of the body's internal state. They would also take a detailed history, asking about the patient's diet, their lifestyle, their emotions, and even the season and the weather, as all of these external factors were believed to influence the internal balance of the humours. Once the specific imbalance was identified, the goal of treatment was simple and logical: to restore equilibrium. This was most often done by removing the excess humour or by strengthening the deficient one. The primary method for removing an excess humour was famously bloodletting. If a patient was deemed to have too much blood, causing a fever or inflammation, a vein would be opened and a specific amount of blood would be drained. This was not seen as a crude or violent act, but as a precise and logical intervention, like opening a sluice gate to lower the level of a flooding river. Other methods of evacuation were also used, such as inducing vomiting or diarrhea with purgative herbs to remove excess bile, or using diuretics to increase the flow of urine. But treatment was not just about removal. It was also about restoring balance through lifestyle and diet, a concept known as regimen. The physician would prescribe a detailed course of diet, exercise, and rest, all tailored to counteract the patient's specific humoral imbalance. A person with an excess of cold, wet phlegm might be prescribed a diet of hot, dry foods, like roasted meats and spicy herbs, and encouraged to take vigorous exercise to warm and dry the body. A person with an excess of hot, dry yellow bile might be advised to eat cool, moist foods, like fruits and vegetables, and to rest in a cool, calm environment. This was a holistic and deeply personalized form of medicine. The physician was not just treating a disease, they were treating a whole person, helping them to realign their own personal microcosm with the natural order of the macrocosm. To contemplate the world of the humours is to see a system of medicine that was both beautiful in its logical symmetry and profoundly wrong in its underlying assumptions. There is, of course, no such thing as black bile, and the functions of the other fluids are far more complex than the Greeks imagined. Bloodletting in most cases would have only weakened an already sick patient, and yet for 2,000 years this was the dominant paradigm of Western medicine. Its longevity is a testament to its power as an explanatory framework. It provided a rational, naturalistic, and comprehensive system for understanding health and disease. It empowered the physician to be a careful observer and a logical thinker, and in its emphasis on diet, lifestyle, and the body's own healing power, it contained a deep and enduring wisdom. The theory of the four humours was a magnificent and elegant intellectual edifice. It was the first great attempt by the human mind to map the inner universe of the body, and it laid the philosophical foundations upon which all of Western medicine would be built. The humoral theory provided a beautiful and complete map of the body's functions, but it was a map drawn almost entirely from philosophy and external observation. The actual physical interior of the human body remained a mysterious and largely unknown territory, a terra incognita. For centuries, a powerful and deeply ingrained taboo, both social and religious, forbade the dissection of the human form. The body was seen as a sacred vessel, the temple of the soul, and to cut it open after death was considered a profound act of desecration. This taboo created a fundamental barrier to medical knowledge. How could one hope to understand the workings of a machine without ever being allowed to look inside? The story of anatomy is the story of the slow, courageous, and often clandestine struggle to overcome this barrier, the story of the silent observers who dared to open the book of the human body and read its physical text. The most influential of these early observers was Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician who lived in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Galen was a towering intellect, a prolific writer, and a physician to emperors and gladiators. He was a firm believer in humoral theory, but he was also a passionate empiricist. He believed that knowledge must be grounded in direct physical observation. However, living in a time and place where human dissection was strictly forbidden, he had to find other ways to explore the body's interior. His solution was to turn to the animal world. He became a master of animal dissection, meticulously studying the anatomy of pigs, goats, and most famously the Barbary ape, whose anatomy he believed most closely resembled that of a human. Let us imagine Galen at work. In a quiet room, away from the public eye, he carefully dissects the body of an ape. With a steady hand and a keen eye, he traces the paths of the nerves from the brain to the muscles. He observes the structure of the heart and the great vessels, the layout of the digestive tract, the form of the kidneys. He performs physiological experiments on living animals, demonstrating how the brain controls the voice by tying off the laryngeal nerve in a squealing pig, or how the kidneys produce urine. He's not just looking, he is questioning, testing, and recording. His work is a masterpiece of patient, empirical inquiry. From these extensive animal dissections, Galen constructed the most detailed and comprehensive model of human anatomy the world had ever seen. He wrote hundreds of treatises, describing the bones, the muscles, the nerves, and the organs in meticulous detail. His anatomical system was a monumental achievement, a vast and intricate synthesis of observation and philosophical reasoning. He believed, for example, that the blood was produced in the liver, flowed out to the body through the veins to provide nourishment, and was consumed by the tissues. He thought that a small portion of this blood seeped from the right side of the heart to the left side through tiny, invisible pores in the septum, where it was mixed with air from the lungs to create a vital spirit that was then distributed to the body by the arteries. Because his work was based on animal anatomy, it contained some significant errors when applied to humans. The human jaw is a single bone, but the ape's is two. The human liver has a different number of lobes than a pig's, and the invisible pores in the heart's septum simply do not exist. But in a world where no one else was allowed to look, Galen's work became the undisputed authority. For the next 1,300 years, his anatomical texts were treated with the same reverence as Holy Scripture. To question Galen was to question the very foundations of medical knowledge. The progress of anatomy came to a standstill, locked in by the immense authority of one man. The spell was finally broken during the Renaissance, in the 16th century. A new spirit of inquiry, of humanism, and of direct observation was sweeping through Europe. And in the field of medicine, this new spirit was embodied by a young, ambitious, and courageous anatomist from Flanders named Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius, a professor at the University of Padua in Italy, was one of the few to be granted the right to perform public human dissections for the education of his students. At first, he, like everyone else, taught directly from the texts of Galen. While a surgeon's assistant performed the dissection, Vesalius would sit on a high chair reading aloud, from the ancient master's work. But Vesalius was a man who trusted his own eyes above all else, and as he compared the words of Galen with the reality of the human body laid out before him, he began to see discrepancies. The jaw was one bone, not two. The liver had the wrong number of lobes. He could find no pores in the septum of the heart. At first, he may have doubted his own eyes, so powerful was Galen's authority. But the evidence was undeniable. Galen, the master, had been wrong. He had been describing an ape, not a human. This realization was a moment of profound intellectual crisis and liberation. Vesalius made a courageous decision. He cast aside the ancient texts, descended from his high chair, and took the knife into his own hands. He became the dissector, the demonstrator, the silent observer who would let the body speak for itself. He dedicated himself to creating a new anatomy, one based entirely on the direct observation of the human form. The result of his tireless work was a magnificent and revolutionary book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, published in 1543. The Fabrica was a masterpiece of both science and art. It contained hundreds of beautiful, intricate, and stunningly accurate woodcut illustrations of the human body, showing the skeleton, the muscles, the nerves, and the organs in breathtaking detail. But it was more than just a collection of pictures. It was a direct and powerful challenge to the authority of the past. In its pages, Vesalius systematically and respectfully corrected over 200 of Galen's errors. He showed the world for the first time what the inside of the human body truly looked like. To contemplate the work of these first anatomists is to appreciate the profound courage it takes to see what is truly there, rather than what you have been told is there. It is a meditation on the power of direct empirical observation. Galen and Vesalius were silent observers, men who listened not to the whispers of spirits, or the logic of philosophers, but to the silent physical testimony of the body itself. They were the cartographers of our inner world, the explorers who mapped the hidden continents within. Their work was often done in secret, in defiance of powerful taboos, but it was this quiet, patient, and sometimes gruesome work that finally opened the door to a true physical understanding of the human machine. They laid the essential groundwork, the physical map upon which all future medical science would be built. For thousands of years, our understanding of the world and of our own bodies was limited by the power of the human eye. We could see the stars in the sky, the plants on the earth, and the intricate visible structures of our own anatomy. But we were living on the shore of a vast unseen ocean, completely unaware of the teeming microscopic universe that existed in a single drop of water, in a speck of dust, or in the saliva from our own mouths. The story of modern medicine, the story of our true understanding of sickness, could not begin until we found a way to see this invisible world. The key to this new universe was not a grand theory or a complex machine, but a tiny, meticulously crafted piece of glass, the lens of the first microscope. Our journey takes us to the bustling city of Delft in the Netherlands, in the latter half of the 17th century. Here lived a man named Antony van Leeuwenhoek. He was not a trained scientist or a university professor. He was a draper, a merchant of cloth, a man whose daily work involved using magnifying glasses to inspect the quality and thread count of his fabrics. But Leeuwenhoek was a man of immense curiosity, patience, and obsessive dedication. He became fascinated with the art of lens grinding. He developed his own secret techniques for creating tiny, powerful, and almost perfectly spherical lenses, some no larger than a pinhead. He would then mount these tiny lenses in small handheld brass or silver plates. These were his microscopes. They were simple, single-lens instruments, but they were the most powerful microscopes in the world at that time, capable of magnifying objects up to 275 times. Leeuwenhoek was not the first person to use a microscope, but he was the first person to turn it upon the world with such a relentless and wide-ranging curiosity. For over 50 years he used his tiny instruments to explore a universe that no human had ever seen before. He looked at everything he could get his hands on. He looked at the sting of a bee, the eye of a fly, the scales of his own skin. He looked at the scrapings from his own teeth, the blood flowing through the capillaries in the tail of an eel, the sperm cells in the semen of animals. He was a tourist in a new and undiscovered country, and he described what he saw in a series of long, detailed and wonder-filled letters to the Royal Society of London. Let us imagine him in his study, a quiet room filled with the tools of his trade. He takes a single drop of rainwater that has been sitting in a pot for a few days. He places it carefully on the tip of a pin before his tiny lens. He squints, adjusts the focus, and looks through. The world he enters is one of profound and shocking wonder. The clear, seemingly empty drop of water is, he discovers, a teeming, bustling, and crowded metropolis. It is filled with thousands of tiny living creatures, animalcules, as he called them, wretched beasties that were 1,000 times smaller than any creature visible to the naked eye. He sees them swimming, tumbling, and darting through the water. He describes their different shapes. Some were long and thin, others were round, some moved with tiny whip-like tails. He was the first human being to witness the world of bacteria and protozoa. This was a discovery of monumental philosophical importance. It was as profound as Galileo turning his telescope to the sky and discovering the moons of Jupiter. Leeuwenhoek had revealed that the visible world was just a thin veneer, and that beneath it lay a vast, complex, and previously unsuspected level of reality. Life was not just the large visible things, the plants, the animals, the humans. Life was everywhere, in a staggering abundance and variety far beyond what anyone had ever imagined. The world, it turned out, was alive. In one of his most famous observations, he took the plaque from between his own teeth. He mixed it with clean rainwater and looked at it through his lens. He was astonished to find an unbelievably great company of living animalcules are moving more nimbly than any I had ever seen up to this time. The biggest sort had a very strong and swift motion and shot through the water, or spittle, like a pike does through the water. The second sort oft-times spun round like a top, and these were far more in number, He had discovered the bacteria living in his own mouth. He noted, with his characteristic curiosity, that after he drank a cup of hot coffee, the number of these animalcules seemed to decrease. He was, in a sense, performing the first rudimentary experiment in microbiology. But for all his incredible observations, Leeuwenhoek did not make the final, crucial connection. He saw these tiny creatures everywhere, but he did not propose that they were the cause of disease. He saw them as a natural, wondrous, and perhaps even charming part of the world's hidden machinery. He was a naturalist, an explorer, a cartographer of a new world. He was content to simply describe what he saw, to marvel at the complexity and abundance of this invisible realm. The idea that these tiny, wretched beasties could be responsible for the great plagues and fevers that had tormented humanity for millennia was a leap of imagination that was still a century and a half away. To contemplate Leeuwenhoek and his glass droplet is to witness a moment of pure, unadulterated discovery. It is a meditation on the power of a single, curious mind and a simple, well-crafted tool to completely change our perception of reality. Leeuwenhoek opened a door. He showed us that there was a vast, unseen world that was intimately and inextricably linked with our own. He did not understand the nature of this world, its dangers or its benefits. He was simply the first to see it, the first to report back from this new frontier. His letters were a message to the future, a message that said, "There is a hidden world, teeming with life, just beyond the limits of your vision. It is here, waiting to be explored. The science of sickness could not move forward until it had a new set of eyes, and Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the humble draper from Delft, was the man who gave them to us. He provided the map of the invisible territory where the true causes of disease were waiting to be found. The door to the microbial world had been opened, but for nearly 200 years its true significance remained a mystery. Leeuwenhoek's animalcules were a curiosity, a marvel of natural philosophy, but they were not seen as central to the story of human sickness. The dominant theory of disease, especially for the great epidemics like cholera and plague, was the miasma theory. This was the idea that disease was caused by bad air, a poisonous, foul-smelling vapour or mist that arose from rotting organic matter, swamps, and other unsanitary places. To prevent disease, one had to avoid these miasmas to clean up the sources of filth and to improve ventilation. This theory, while ultimately incorrect, was a powerful force for good, driving many of the great public health and sanitation reforms of the 19th century. But it could not explain the fundamental nature of contagion. It could not explain how a disease could pass from one person to another. The final, definitive answer to this question required the patient, meticulous, and brilliant work of two men, Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany, who in the latter half of the 19th century finally laid the animalcules to rest and established the germ theory of disease. The story begins not with human disease, but with the practical problems of the French wine and beer industry. Louis Pasteur, a chemist by training, was asked to investigate why some batches of wine and beer were spoiling, turning sour. The prevailing belief was that fermentation and spoilage were purely chemical processes. But Pasteur, using his microscope, noticed a crucial difference. The good, healthy batches of wine were filled with small, round yeast cells. The spoiled, sour batches, however, were contaminated with other, smaller, rod-shaped microorganisms. This led him to a radical hypothesis. It was these living organisms that were responsible for the chemical changes. The yeast was producing the alcohol, and the other contaminating microbes were producing the acid that caused the spoilage. Fermentation was not a chemical process. It was a biological one. To prove this, he performed a series of elegant and now famous experiments. He showed that if he gently heated the wine or beer to a specific temperature, a process that would come to be known as pasteurization, it would kill these contaminating microbes and prevent the spoilage without ruining the taste of the product. He then went on to tackle the age-old belief in spontaneous generation, the idea that living organisms could arise spontaneously from non-living matter, that maggots, for example, could be generated from rotting meat. In his most famous experiment, he used a special swan-necked flask. He placed a nutrient broth in the flask and boiled it, killing any microbes that were present. The long curved neck of the flask allowed air to enter, but it trapped any dust particles and airborne microbes in its lower bend. The broth in the flask remained clear and sterile indefinitely. But if he broke the neck of the flask, allowing the dust and microbes to fall in, the broth would quickly become cloudy, teeming with life. He had proven, once and for all, that life only comes from life. The microbes in the cloudy broth did not arise spontaneously. They were the offspring of the microbes that had entered from the air. These experiments, while not directly related to human disease, laid the essential groundwork. Pasteur had shown that specific microscopic organisms could cause specific, observable, chemical and biological changes in their environment. The leap to human disease was a logical next step. If a microbe could sour wine, could another different microbe cause a disease in a human? It was the German physician Robert Koch who provided the final, irrefutable proof. Koch was a country doctor who became obsessed with understanding the cause of anthrax, a deadly disease that affected both cattle and humans. He was a master of the microscope and a brilliant methodical laboratory technician. He began by examining the blood of animals that had died of anthrax. He found, as others had before him, that their blood was filled with a specific rod-shaped bacterium. But this was just a correlation. To prove causation, he had to go further. He took a tiny speck of blood from an infected animal and injected it into a healthy mouse. The mouse developed anthrax and died. He then took blood from that second mouse and injected it into a third, which also died. He repeated this process for 20 generations of mice, demonstrating that the disease and the specific bacterium could be transmitted from one animal to another. But his greatest contribution was his development of a method to grow these bacteria in a pure culture outside the body. He devised a way to grow them on a solid medium, a slice of potato at first, and later a gelatin-based substance in a flat glass dish, the Petri dish. This was a revolutionary technique. For the first time, a single bacterial cell could be isolated and grown into a visible, pure colony, a population of millions of identical cells. This allowed a specific type of bacterium to be studied in isolation. Koch could now take a pure culture of the anthrax bacterium grown in his lab and inject it into a healthy animal. The animal would develop anthrax. He had proven beyond any doubt that this specific bacterium was the cause of this specific disease. From this meticulous work, he formulated a set of criteria, now known as Koch's postulates, a rigorous, step-by-step procedure for proving that a specific microbe causes a specific disease. One must find the microbe in all cases of the disease, one must isolate it from the host and grow it in a pure culture, one must reproduce the disease by injecting the cultured microbe into a healthy, susceptible host, and one must be able to recover the same microbe from the experimentally infected host. This was the birth of medical microbiology. It was a clear, rigorous, and repeatable scientific method for identifying the enemy. Using these postulates, Koch himself went on to identify the bacteria that caused tuberculosis and cholera, two of the greatest killers of the 19th century. The establishment of the germ theory of disease was a moment of profound stillness in the history of medicine. It was the moment when the noise and confusion of 1,000 competing theories, of miasmas, of humours, of spontaneous generation, finally fell silent, replaced by a single, clear, and powerful truth. Sickness was not a mysterious vapour, a moral failing, or a spiritual imbalance. It was a biological process, a conflict between a host and a specific, identifiable, microscopic invader. This realization changed everything. It gave medicine a clear target. The enemy was no longer an invisible, unknowable force. The enemy had a name, a shape, and a biology that could be studied, and if it could be studied, it could be fought. The germ theory did not, in itself, provide any cures, but it provided the essential foundation, the great, quiet, and unshakable truth upon which the entire edifice of modern infectious disease medicine would be built. Before the germ theory had been fully articulated by Pasteur and Koch, before the enemy had been clearly identified under the microscope, a young Hungarian doctor in a Vienna hospital made a simple, profound, and ultimately tragic observation. His story is not one of a celebrated scientific breakthrough, but of a quiet, intuitive leap of understanding that was met with ridicule and rejection. It is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, and it is a meditation on one of the most simple, yet powerful acts in the entire history of healing, the act of washing one's hands. His work was a quiet prelude to the germ theory, a single, clear note of truth sung in a world that was not yet ready to hear it. Our story takes us to the Vienna General Hospital in the year 1846. Semmelweis was a physician in the hospital's maternity clinic. The clinic was divided into two separate wards. The first clinic was staffed by male doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed entirely by female midwives. There was a stark and terrifying difference between these two wards. The mortality rate from puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a mysterious and almost invariably fatal infection that struck women after childbirth, was dramatically and consistently higher in the first clinic, the one staffed by the doctors. In some months, the death rate in the doctor's clinic was 5 times higher than in the midwife's clinic. Women who were admitted to the hospital would beg to be placed in the second clinic, and some even preferred to give birth in the streets rather than be admitted to the first. This discrepancy was a source of great mystery and anguish for the young Dr. Semmelweis. He was a man of deep empathy, and he was haunted by the deaths of these young mothers. He began to investigate systematically and obsessively, searching for an explanation. He considered every possible difference between the two wards. Was it the birthing position? He had the women in the first clinic adopt the same position as those in the second. The death rate did not change. Was it a psychological factor? He noted that a priest ringing a bell would walk through the first clinic to administer last rites to the dying, an act that terrified the other patients. He had the priest change his route and silence his bell. The death rate did not change. He considered overcrowding, diet, and ventilation. Nothing could explain the terrible persistent difference. The crucial clue came not from the maternity ward, but from the autopsy room. In 1847, a colleague and friend of Semmelweis, a pathologist named Jakob Kolečka, died after accidentally cutting his finger with a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Semmelweis studied the report of his friend's autopsy and was struck by a shocking realization. The pathology of his friend's illness, the widespread inflammation, the fever, the abscesses, was identical to that of the women who were dying of childbed fever. For the first time, a connection was made. Kolečka had died because he had been exposed to what Semmelweis called cadaverous particles from the corpses in the autopsy room, and the doctors and medical students in the first clinic, Semmelweis realized, were coming directly from the autopsy room to the maternity ward to examine the pregnant women and to deliver their babies. The midwives in the second clinic, on the other hand, had no contact with the autopsy room. The horrifying truth dawned on him. The doctors, in their quest to learn from the dead, were unwittingly carrying the agents of death on their own hands. They were the source of the epidemic. Their hands, contaminated with invisible particles from the corpses, were introducing the fatal infection into the bodies of the mothers during their examinations. This was a radical and deeply unsettling idea. It flew in the face of the prevailing miasma theory. The cause of the disease was not a bad air or a mysterious vapour. It was a tangible physical substance, a decomposing animal organic matter that could be carried from one person to another. Based on this insight, Semmelweis instituted a new and mandatory policy in his clinic in May of 1847. He ordered all doctors and students to wash their hands and their instruments in a solution of chlorinated lime, a powerful disinfectant, before entering the maternity ward and before examining any patient. The result was immediate, dramatic, and undeniable. The mortality rate in the first clinic plummeted. In April, before the hand-washing policy was instituted, the death rate had been 18.3%. In June, just 1 month after the policy began, it was 2.2%. In the following months, it dropped to near zero, becoming even lower than the rate in the midwife's clinic. Semmelweis had, through a simple act of hygiene, virtually eliminated childbed fever from his ward. He had saved countless lives. One would expect such a dramatic success to be met with celebration and immediate widespread adoption. But the reality was the opposite. Semmelweis's discovery was met with resistance, with skepticism, and with outright hostility from the Viennese medical establishment. His theory was an implicit and deeply offensive accusation. He was telling his senior colleagues, the respected professors and physicians of Vienna, that they were responsible for the deaths of their own patients. It was an attack on their professional pride and their personal cleanliness. They were gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands were clean. The idea that they could be carrying a foul, invisible poison was an insult. Semmelweis, for his part, was not a tactful or diplomatic man. He was passionate, obsessive, and increasingly angry at the refusal of his colleagues to accept the clear and overwhelming evidence. He published his findings, but he did so in a way that was often aggressive and accusatory. He was eventually dismissed from his post at the Vienna hospital. He returned to his native Hungary, where he implemented his hand-washing policies with great success. But he grew increasingly isolated, bitter, and mentally unstable. He railed against the ignorance of the medical profession, writing furious open letters to the leading obstetricians of Europe, calling them irresponsible homicides. In 1865, at the age of 47, he suffered a mental breakdown and was committed to an asylum. In a tragic and terrible irony, he died there just 2 weeks later, from a septic infection in a wound on his hand, the very same kind of infection that he had fought so hard to prevent in others. The story of Ignaz Semmelweis is a profound and heartbreaking meditation on the nature of scientific discovery and the resistance to change. He was a man who was ahead of his time, a man who had discovered a life-saving truth through pure empirical observation, but who could not convince a world that was not ready to listen. His work was a demonstration of the power of a simple physical act. The clean hand he had shown was the difference between life and death. It would be another 20 years before the work of Pasteur and Koch would provide the full, scientific explanation for what Semmelweis had only been able to observe. The cadaverous particles would be given a name, bacteria. But the quiet, tragic, and ultimately vindicated work of Ignaz Semmelweis remains a powerful testament to the idea that sometimes the greatest leaps forward in human healing come not from a complex new technology or a brilliant new theory, but from a simple, humble, and compassionate act of care. For all of human history, from the first prehistoric healer tending to a wound to the most skilled Renaissance surgeon, one terrible and immutable reality lay at the very heart of the healer's art. That reality was pain. It was the body's primal, unavoidable, and deeply personal response to the trauma of being cut, sawn, and stitched. The experience of undergoing a surgical operation was, for millennia, an experience of pure, unmitigated, and fully conscious agony. There was no way to silence the body's desperate cry of protest against the violation of the knife. The operating theatre was not a place of quiet healing, but a place of visceral, audible terror. Patients were held or strapped down, their screams echoing through the halls, a sound that haunted not only the patient but the practitioner as well. The surgeon's art of necessity was a brutal one. The most celebrated surgeon was not the one who was most careful, most precise, or most knowledgeable, but the one who was fastest. Speed was the only form of mercy they could offer. An amputation was a whirlwind of saw, sponge, and suture, a desperate race against the limits of human endurance, often completed in less than 2 minutes. This terrible, ever-present reality of pain was the sleeping thorn in the side of medicine, a fundamental barrier to progress that seemed as permanent and as unsolvable as death itself. The story of anesthesia is the story of the removal of this thorn, the story of the discovery that finally gave medicine the profound and sacred gift of stillness. The search for a way to dull pain is as old as suffering itself. Our ancient ancestors, in their quiet observation of the earth, discovered plants that could alter consciousness and numb the senses. The opium poppy, the coca leaf, the mandrake root, these were nature's own anesthetics. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe using a mixture of ground marble and vinegar, which would release carbon dioxide to induce a state of unconsciousness. The Assyrians are said to have induced coma in children before circumcision by compressing the carotid arteries in their neck. Alcohol, in large quantities, was used to produce a state of drunken stupor. But all of these methods were a dangerous and unreliable gamble. The line between insensibility and death was perilously thin. The dose required to quiet the patient's screams was often the dose that would quiet their heart forever. For the most part, through the Middle Ages and into the modern era, the only tools a surgeon had to manage their patient were physical restraint and their own terrifying speed. The pain of surgery was simply accepted as a necessary, unavoidable part of the cure. The breakthrough, when it finally came in the middle of the 19th century, did not emerge from the hallowed halls of academic medicine or the dedicated research of a university laboratory. It arose, instead, from the world of popular entertainment, chemical curiosities, and the recreational drug use of young, educated men. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of great discovery in chemistry, and it became fashionable to hold public demonstrations of the strange and amusing effects of newly isolated gases. One of these was nitrous oxide, first synthesized by Joseph Priestley in 1772. The chemist, Humphrey Davy, after experimenting with the gas on himself, noted its euphoric effects and its ability to relieve the pain of a toothache, famously nicknaming it laughing gas. He even suggested its potential use in surgery, but his suggestion was ignored for nearly half a century. Instead, nitrous oxide became a public spectacle. Travelling showmen would hold laughing gas demonstrations, charging admission for people to watch volunteers inhale the gas and behave in giddy, uninhibited ways. A similar recreational use grew up around another volatile chemical, sulfuric ether. First synthesized in the 16th century, ether's intoxicating properties became a source of amusement in the 1840s, particularly among medical students in America. Ether frolics were parties where young men would gather to inhale the vapor from a handkerchief, enjoying the profound, drunken delirium it produced. It was a common observation at these parties that participants would often stumble, fall and injure themselves, receiving cuts and bruises, but would feel no pain until the effects of the ether wore off. The clues were there. The key to painless surgery was being passed around at parties, a parlour trick, a form of youthful rebellion. But it took a specific kind of mind, a mind grappling directly with the problem of pain, to see the connection. That mind belonged to a young, ambitious and ultimately tragic dentist in Hartford, Connecticut, named Horace Wells. In December of 1844, Wells attended a laughing gas demonstration hosted by a travelling showman. He watched with interest as a local man, Samuel Cooley, volunteered to inhale the gas. Under its influence, Cooley became agitated and began running around the stage, stumbling and badly gashing his leg on a wooden bench. Wells, sitting in the audience, noticed something remarkable. Cooley sat down, his leg bleeding profusely, but he seemed completely unaware of his injury, feeling no pain. As the effects of the gas wore off, the pain set in. But Wells had seen enough. The connection had been made. The very next day, Wells decided to perform a daring experiment on himself. He would test the gas's properties in a real medical context. He arranged for the showman to bring a bag of nitrous oxide to his dental office. He then sat in his own dental chair, inhaled the gas until he was insensible, and had a colleague, Dr. John Riggs, extract one of his own troublesome wisdom teeth. Wells felt nothing. As he awoke from the gas-induced stupor, free of his tooth and free of the pain, he is said to have exclaimed, "A new era in tooth-pulling." He was convinced he had found the solution to the agony of dentistry and surgery. Eager to share his discovery with the world, Wells arranged to give a public demonstration at the most prestigious medical institution in the country, the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. This was his chance to prove his theory to the surgical elite. In January of 1845, he stood before a skeptical audience of doctors and medical students in the hospital's surgical amphitheatre. He administered nitrous oxide to a patient who was scheduled to have a tooth extracted. But something went wrong. Perhaps Wells, nervous and eager, did not administer a large enough dose. Perhaps the patient was not fully under its influence when the procedure began. As the dentist pulled the tooth, the patient, though later admitting he felt little pain, cried out. The audience, primed for failure, immediately erupted in jeers and hisses. "Humbug!" they shouted. "Humbug!" Wells, a sensitive and proud man, was utterly humiliated. He had found the key to painless surgery, but he had fumbled at the lock, and the door had been slammed in his face. He returned to Hartford a broken man, his reputation in tatters. The key, however, was not lost. It was picked up by another man, a former student and one-time business partner of Wells, a Boston dentist named William T.G. Morton. Morton was ambitious, opportunistic, and keenly aware of Wells's work and his failure. He was also familiar with the more powerful effects of sulfuric ether from his time as a medical student. He believed ether could produce a deeper, more reliable, and longer-lasting state of unconsciousness than nitrous oxide. He began to experiment secretly, first on his dog, then on himself, inhaling the fumes until he passed out. Convinced of its power, he began using it on his dental patients, but he disguised the substance, calling it lithion, after the river of forgetfulness in Greek mythology, hoping to patent it and secure a commercial fortune. Morton, a man of great ambition and showmanship, then arranged his own public demonstration at the very same place where Wells had been so cruelly humiliated, the surgical amphitheatre of the Massachusetts General Hospital. The date was October 16th, 1846, a date that would become a landmark in the history of medicine. The patient was a young printer named Gilbert Abbott, who had a vascular tumour on the side of his neck. The surgeon was the eminent Dr. John Collins Warren, the same man who had presided over Wells's failed demonstration. The room was filled with the same sceptical, black-coated surgeons and students, their arms crossed, expecting another humbug. Morton arrived late, having been delayed while making last-minute adjustments to a new glass inhaler he had designed to deliver the ether vapour. The atmosphere was tense. Dr. Warren, impatient and world-weary, was about to proceed with the operation in the usual brutal fashion. But Morton finally arrived, and the procedure began. He placed the inhaler over Abbott's mouth and nose and instructed him to breathe deeply. Within minutes, the patient's eyes closed, and he fell into a deep, quiet, sleep-like state. Morton turned to Dr. Warren. "Sir," he said, "your patient is ready." Warren, with an air of profound skepticism, picked up his scalpel. He turned to the audience. "As there is a new patient, gentlemen, I will give him a chance," he said, his tone suggesting he fully expected the patient to leap up screaming. He then made the first incision into the patient's neck. The room was utterly silent. The patient did not scream. He did not struggle. He did not even flinch. A collective gasp went through the audience. The doctors, who had been sitting back with their arms crossed, now leaned forward, their faces a mask of stunned, breathless disbelief. Warren, his own skepticism melting away in the face of the miracle before him, continued with the operation. For 15 minutes, he carefully dissected the tumour from the patient's neck. The only sounds in the room were the quiet instructions of the surgeon and the clink of his instruments. It was a scene of unprecedented, almost holy stillness. When the operation was complete and the patient began to stir, Warren turned to the astonished audience and made the famous, understated pronouncement, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The sleeping thorn had been removed. The news of this successful demonstration spread across the Atlantic with incredible speed. Within weeks, surgeons in London and Paris were successfully using ether to perform painless operations. A new era in medicine had dawned. The bitter irony was that this great gift to humanity brought little but misery to its pioneers. A furious and ugly public battle over who deserved the credit erupted between Morton, the now resurrected Horace Wells, and another claimant, a Georgia doctor named Crawford Long, who had quietly used ether in his own practice years earlier, but had never published or promoted his work. The controversy would drive Wells to suicide, and Morton would die penniless and broken-hearted, his life consumed by the fight for recognition. But their tragic personal fates could not diminish the magnitude of their discovery. Anesthesia transformed the art of surgery from a brutal, terrifying race against time into a careful, precise, and patient science. It allowed surgeons to work with a calm focus, to perform longer, more complex and more life-saving procedures than had ever been imagined. It did not just conquer pain, it fundamentally changed the relationship between the patient and the healer, replacing terror with trust and agony with a quiet, peaceful and compassionate sleep. The germ theory of disease had given humanity a clear and identifiable enemy. The work of Pasteur and Koch had revealed the invisible world of bacteria, the tiny invaders responsible for so many of the great plagues and pestilences that had tormented our species. But identifying the enemy was only the first step. The far greater challenge was to find a way to fight it. For decades after the germ theory was established, a diagnosis of a serious bacterial infection was still, in essence, a death sentence. Doctors could offer supportive care, they could try to manage the symptoms, but they had no weapon that could directly attack and kill the invading microbes without also killing the patient. The great dream of medicine became the search for a magic bullet, a term coined by the German scientist Paul Ehrlich. This would be a chemical, a drug, that could selectively target and destroy the invading germ while leaving the host's own cells unharmed. The story of the first antibiotics is the story of the realization of this dream, a story of painstaking research, of brilliant insight, and of one of the most famous and fortunate accidents in the history of science. The first major breakthrough in this search came from the laboratory of Paul Ehrlich himself. Ehrlich was a brilliant and visionary chemist, obsessed with the idea of selective toxicity. He spent years systematically synthesizing and testing hundreds of different chemical compounds, searching for one that would be effective against the bacterium that causes syphilis, a devastating and widespread disease. His method was a slow, laborious, and often frustrating process of trial and error. He called it chemotherapy, the treatment of disease with known chemical compounds. In 1909, after testing over 600 different arsenic-based compounds, he and his team finally found one, compound number 606, which they named salvarsan. It was highly effective against the syphilis spirochete, but it was also highly toxic to the patient. It was not a perfect magic bullet, but it was a proof of concept. It showed that chemicals could, in principle, be used to cure infectious diseases. The true dawn of the antibiotic age, however, came not from a systematic search, but from a moment of serendipity in a cluttered London laboratory in September of 1928. The laboratory belonged to Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist working at St Mary's Hospital. Fleming was a brilliant but notoriously untidy researcher. His lab bench was often a chaotic jumble of old petri dishes. Before leaving for a 2-week holiday, he had been growing cultures of Staphylococcus bacteria, a common cause of boils, abscesses, and other infections. When he returned, he began the tedious task of cleaning up his bench, sorting through the dozens of old culture plates. Let us pause and contemplate this quiet, mundane moment. Fleming is sorting through his old experiments, preparing to discard them. On one of the plates, he notices something unusual. The plate had been contaminated with a common blue-green mold, a species of penicillium. This was a common occurrence in a bacteriology lab, but Fleming, a man with a keen and observant eye, noticed something else, something that another, tidier researcher might have missed. In the area immediately surrounding the patch of mold, the colonies of Staphylococcus had been destroyed. They had become transparent and were dissolving. It was as if the mold were emitting some invisible substance, a mold juice, that was killing the bacteria. This was the moment of discovery. Fleming was not the first person to see mold contaminate a bacterial culture, but he was the first to understand the significance of what he was seeing. He recognized that he had stumbled upon a potential weapon in the ancient invisible war between the microbes themselves. The mold was fighting the bacteria. He took a sample of the mold and grew it in a liquid broth. He then filtered out the mold and tested the remaining juice. He found that it was incredibly powerful. It could kill a wide range of disease-causing bacteria, including those responsible for scarlet fever, pneumonia, meningitis, and diphtheria. And crucially, when he injected it into mice, it appeared to be completely harmless to the animal's own cells. This was it. This was a potential magic bullet. Fleming named the active substance penicillin. However, the story of penicillin is a story in 3 parts, a relay race of discovery passed between 3 different teams in 3 different decades. Fleming had made the fundamental observation, but he was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He found that penicillin was incredibly unstable and difficult to produce in large quantities. He could never isolate and purify the active compound. For over a decade, his discovery remained a scientific curiosity, a promising but impractical finding, published in a relatively obscure journal and largely ignored by the wider medical community. The baton was picked up over 10 years later at the University of Oxford on the eve of the Second World War. A team of researchers led by the Australian pathologist Howard Florey and the German Jewish refugee chemist Ernst Boris Chain decided to undertake a systematic survey of naturally occurring antibacterial substances. They stumbled upon Fleming's old paper on penicillin. Intrigued, they managed to acquire a sample of Fleming's original mold and began the difficult and painstaking work of trying to isolate and purify the active ingredient. It was a monumental task. The amount of penicillin produced by the mold was tiny, and the substance was incredibly fragile. They started by growing the mold in hospital bedpans and later in specially designed fermentation vessels. They developed a complex multi-stage chemical process to extract and concentrate the penicillin, eventually producing a small amount of a stable brownish powder. In May of 1940, they were ready to test their purified penicillin on living animals. They took 8 mice and infected them with a lethal dose of Streptococcus bacteria. They then treated 4 of the mice with their penicillin powder. The other 4 were left as untreated controls. The next morning, the result was stark and unambiguous. The 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 mice that had received penicillin were alive and perfectly healthy. Florey, seeing the result, is said to have quietly remarked, "It looks quite promising." The next step was to test it on a human. Their first patient in February of 1941 was a 43-year-old policeman named Albert Alexander. He was dying of a severe staphylococcal and streptococcal infection that had started with a simple scratch from a rose thorn. His entire body was covered in abscesses and he had lost an eye. He was given an injection of penicillin. The effect was miraculous. Within 24 hours his fever dropped and his infection began to recede. He was recovering. But the problem of supply was acute. The Oxford team did not have enough penicillin to complete the treatment. They even resorted to extracting the unmetabolized penicillin from the patient's own urine to be re-administered. But it was not enough. After 5 days, their supply of the drug ran out. The infection returned with a vengeance, and the policeman died. They had proven that penicillin worked, but they had also proven that they could not make enough of it. The final chapter of the story took place in the United States. With Britain in the midst of the war, large-scale production was impossible. Florey and a colleague travelled to the US in the summer of 1941, carrying a sample of the precious mould in a coat pocket. They presented their findings to the American government and to major pharmaceutical companies. The US, recognizing the immense potential of the drug to treat wounded soldiers, launched a massive, government-coordinated effort to solve the problem of mass production. Scientists at a government lab in Peoria, Illinois, scoured the world for better, higher-yielding strains of the penicillium mold, famously finding the most productive strain on a moldy cantaloupe from a local market. Chemical engineers developed new, large-scale deep fermentation techniques, using huge 10,000-gallon vats to grow the mold. The effort was a staggering success. By the time of the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944, enough penicillin was being produced to treat every single one of the wounded Allied soldiers. The age of antibiotics had truly begun. For the first time in history, humanity had a weapon that could reliably cure a vast range of bacterial infections that had been major causes of death for millennia. Pneumonia, syphilis, gonorrhea, scarlet fever, diphtheria, all could now be treated. The magic bullet had been found, not through a systematic chemical search, but in the quiet biological warfare of the microbes themselves, a secret whispered by a patch of mould on a forgotten petri dish. The discovery of penicillin was a turning point in human history, a moment that fundamentally changed our relationship with the microbial world and gave us a powerful, if temporary, upper hand in our long and ancient battle with infectious disease. Our journey into the science of sickness has so far been a story of external invaders. We have seen how the germ theory identified microscopic organisms as the cause of infectious disease, and how the discovery of antibiotics gave us a weapon to fight them. But there is another, deeper, and far more intimate source of human ailment. This is the sickness that arises not from an external attack, but from within our own bodies, from the very instructions that build and operate our cells. This is the world of genetic disease. To understand this world, we must travel to the very centre of the cell, to the nucleus, and unlock the secret of the molecule that carries the blueprint of life itself. This is the story of the discovery of the structure of DNA, the beautiful, elegant, and iconic double helix. It is a story of brilliant insight, of fierce competition, and of a single, stunning image that revealed the fundamental secret of life's code. For decades, in the first half of the 20th century, biologists knew that there must be some kind of hereditary molecule, a physical substance that was passed down from one generation to the next, carrying the instructions for building an organism. They knew that this molecule must reside in the chromosomes, the thread-like structures visible in the nucleus of the cell during cell division, and they knew that the chromosomes were made of 2 main components, proteins and a mysterious acidic substance called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. For a long time, the smart money was on the proteins. Proteins were complex. They were built from 20 different amino acid building blocks, allowing for an almost infinite variety of structures and functions. DNA, on the other hand, seemed boringly simple. It was made of only 4 different building blocks called nucleotides. It seemed impossible that such a simple molecule could carry the vast amount of information needed to build a human being. But a series of clever experiments, most famously one conducted by Alfred Hershey and Martha Chase in 1952, provided definitive proof that it was, in fact, the DNA, and not the protein, that carried the genetic information. The race was now on to solve the three-dimensional structure of the DNA molecule. It was clear to everyone involved that the structure itself must hold the key to understanding how it worked. How could this molecule store information, and how could it be copied so perfectly from one generation to the next? The answer to these questions, everyone believed, would be revealed in its shape. The story converges on a handful of brilliant and competitive researchers in England in the early 1950s. At Cambridge University were two young scientists, the brash, brilliant American, James Watson, and the thoughtful, older Englishman, Francis Crick. They were not performing their own experiments on DNA. They were model builders, trying to solve the structure by building physical, Tinker-Toy-like models that were consistent with all the known chemical and physical properties of the molecule. At King's College in London, two other scientists were using a different, experimental approach. Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin were experts in a technique called X-ray crystallography. This involved taking a purified, crystalline sample of a substance, shooting a beam of X-rays at it, and analysing the pattern of spots that the X-rays made on a piece of photographic film. The pattern of the spots, while not a direct picture of the molecule, contained crucial, mathematical clues about its three-dimensional structure. The relationship between these two groups was complex and fraught with tension. Rosalind Franklin was a brilliant and meticulous experimentalist, a true expert in her craft. She had developed a way to produce incredibly clear and detailed X-ray diffraction images of DNA. She was a cautious and methodical scientist who believed that the structure should be solved through the slow, patient accumulation of experimental data, not through the speculative playing of model building. She was also a woman in a deeply male-dominated scientific world, and she often found herself isolated and not given the respect her work deserved. The key moment in the story came in early 1953. Without Franklin's knowledge or permission, her colleague Maurice Wilkins showed one of her best X-ray images to James Watson. This image, which has since become one of the most famous photographs in the history of science, is known as Photo 51. To a layperson, it is just a fuzzy, cross-shaped pattern of dark spots. But to someone who knew how to read it, like Watson and Crick, it was a revelation. The distinct X shape in the centre of the image was the unmistakable signature of a helix, a spiral staircase. The dimensions of the X told them the steepness of the helix. And the missing spots on the fourth layer of the X told them something even more profound. It was a double helix, two spiral staircases intertwined. Armed with this crucial piece of information from Franklin's data, Watson and Crick raced back to their model building. The pieces of the puzzle now began to fall into place with incredible speed. They knew it was a double helix. They knew from other chemical data that the backbone of the helix was made of repeating sugar and phosphate groups, and that the four nucleotide bases, adenine-A, guanine, G, cytosine, C, and thymine, T, were pointed towards the centre. Our journey into the science of sickness has revealed a fundamental and recurring theme: the body's constant struggle to distinguish self from other. The immune system, a vast and intricate network of cells and molecules, is the guardian of this distinction. It is a silent, vigilant army, constantly patrolling our inner universe, identifying and destroying foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses while leaving our own, native cells untouched. The story of infectious disease is the story of this army fighting a foreign enemy. But what happens when this system of recognition breaks down? What happens when the body's own guardians can no longer tell friend from foe? This is the story of autoimmune disease, one of the most mysterious, complex, and philosophically challenging areas of modern medicine. It is the story of a civil war, a battle in which the body's own defense system turns against itself and the protector becomes the aggressor. To understand autoimmunity, we must first contemplate the profound miracle of self-tolerance. From the moment of our birth, our immune system is engaged in a complex and continuous process of education. In the thymus, a small gland behind the breastbone, our developing immune cells, particularly the T cells, are put through a rigorous schooling. They are presented with a vast library of self-antigens, tiny molecular fragments from every protein and cell type in our own bodies. Any T cell that reacts too strongly to one of these self-antigens, any cell that shows the potential to attack its own body, is eliminated. It is forced to undergo a process of programmed cell death, a form of cellular suicide. It is a ruthless but essential process of negative selection. Only the cells that can prove their ability to ignore the self are allowed to graduate and circulate in the body. This process creates a state of self-tolerance, a deep cellular wisdom that allows the immune system to coexist peacefully with the body it is sworn to protect. Autoimmune disease is the breakdown of this peace. It is a failure of self-tolerance. For reasons that we are still struggling to fully understand, the immune system makes a mistake. It misidentifies a normal, healthy part of the body, a specific type of cell, a tissue, or a protein, as a foreign invader. It flags this self-tissue as an enemy, and once this mistake is made, the full destructive power of the immune system is unleashed upon it. T cells, which are designed to kill virus-infected cells, begin to attack and destroy healthy body cells. B cells, which are designed to produce antibodies that tag bacteria for destruction, begin to produce autoantibodies that target the body's own tissues, marking them for elimination. The result is a chronic, sustained, and often progressive assault on the self. The nature of the disease depends entirely on what part of the body has been mistakenly targeted. Autoimmunity is not a single disease, but a vast and diverse family of over 80 different conditions. If the immune system attacks the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas, the result is type 1 diabetes. If it attacks the myelin sheath that insulates the nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord, the result is multiple sclerosis, leading to a progressive loss of motor function and sensation. If it attacks the lining of the joints, the result is rheumatoid arthritis, causing chronic pain, inflammation, and joint destruction. In other diseases, the attack is more systemic. In lupus, the immune system produces autoantibodies that can attack a wide range of tissues throughout the body, including the skin, the joints, the kidneys, and the brain, leading to a complex and unpredictable array of symptoms. To contemplate the experience of living with an autoimmune disease is to meditate on a profound sense of betrayal. The very system that is meant to protect you has become the source of your suffering. The body is at war with itself. The symptoms are often invisible to the outside world, a hidden internal battle that can lead to profound fatigue, chronic pain, and a sense of isolation. The course of the disease is often unpredictable, characterized by periods of flare, when the immune system is highly active and symptoms are severe, followed by periods of remission, when the battle seems to have temporarily subsided. It is a life lived in a state of uncertainty, never knowing when your own body will turn on you again. The question at the heart of all autoimmune research is, why? Why does this carefully orchestrated system of self-tolerance break down? The answer is incredibly complex, a subtle and still mysterious interplay between genetic predisposition and environmental triggers. We know that genetics plays a crucial role. These diseases often run in families, and scientists have identified specific genes, particularly those involved in regulating the immune system, that can increase a person's susceptibility. But genetics is not the whole story. Most people with these susceptibility genes will never develop an autoimmune disease. There must be an environmental trigger, a spark that ignites the fire in a genetically predisposed individual. What could these triggers be? One leading hypothesis is that they are infections. In a phenomenon known as molecular mimicry, a foreign invader, like a virus or a bacterium, might have a protein on its surface that looks very similar to a protein on one of our own cells. The immune system mounts a powerful and appropriate attack on the invader. But after the infection is cleared, the immune system, now on high alert, may mistakenly redirect its attack towards the similar-looking self-protein. The battle against the foreign enemy becomes a chronic, misguided war against the self. Other potential triggers are also being investigated, including exposure to certain chemicals or toxins, changes in the gut microbiome, the vast community of bacteria that lives in our intestines, and even hormonal changes, which may help to explain why many autoimmune diseases are far more common in women than in men. The treatment of autoimmune disease has, for a long time, been a crude and difficult balancing act. Since the problem is an overactive immune system, the primary approach has been to suppress it. Drugs like corticosteroids are powerful, broad-spectrum immune suppressants. They can be very effective at reducing inflammation and controlling the symptoms of a flare-up, but they do so by weakening the entire immune system, leaving the patient vulnerable to real infections. It is a form of chemical carpet bombing, quieting the civil war by disarming the entire army, both the rogue factions and the loyal soldiers. More recently, a new generation of biologic drugs has been developed, offering a more targeted approach. These are engineered antibodies that are designed to block a specific single molecule or pathway involved in the inflammatory process. They are more like a sniper's rifle than a carpet bomb, targeting a specific leader of the rebellion without disabling the entire defense force. These drugs have revolutionized the treatment of many autoimmune diseases, offering many patients a level of relief and a quality of life that was previously unimaginable. But they are not a cure. They manage the symptoms, they quiet the battle, but they do not fix the underlying mistake in recognition. They do not re-educate the immune system or restore the state of self-tolerance. The story of autoimmune disease is a story that brings us to the very frontier of our understanding of self. It forces us to ask deep philosophical questions. What is the self at a biological level? Where is the line between me and not me? And how is that line so beautifully and sometimes so tragically drawn? To study autoimmunity is to study the body's own intelligence, its own memory, and its own capacity for error. It is a journey into a world where the enemy is not a foreign invader, but a distorted reflection of ourselves, a civil war raging silently, cell by cell, within the deep, inner universe of the human body. We have explored the sickness that comes from without, the invasion of the germ, and the sickness that comes from within, the civil war of autoimmunity. Now, we must turn our attention to a third, and perhaps most feared form of ailment, the sickness that arises when our own cells forget how to die. This is the story of cancer. Cancer is not an invader. It is not a case of mistaken identity. It is a disease of our own flesh, a rebellion that begins with a single, malfunctioning cell. It is a disease born from a breakdown in the most ancient and fundamental rules that govern our cellular society, the rules of growth and death. To contemplate cancer is to meditate on the delicate, precarious balance between order and chaos that allows our complex multicellular bodies to exist. Our bodies are a cooperative society of trillions of cells. Each cell has a specific role, a specific function, and it performs this role in constant communication with its neighbours. This cellular society is governed by a strict set of laws that are written in our genetic code, our DNA. These laws dictate when a cell should grow and divide, when it should differentiate into a specialised cell type, and crucially, when it should die. This last process, known as apoptosis or programmed cell death, is not a failure, but an essential and healthy part of life. Cells that are old, damaged, or no longer needed are instructed to commit a quiet, orderly suicide, making way for new, healthy cells. It is a constant, gentle process of renewal that keeps our tissues healthy and in balance. Cancer begins when a single cell breaks these laws. It becomes a cellular outlaw. This process starts with a change, mutation, in the cell's DNA. Our DNA is constantly being damaged by simple errors during cell division, by exposure to radiation from the sun, or by contact with carcinogenic chemicals in our environment. Most of the time, the cell has a sophisticated set of proofreading and repair genes that can detect and fix this damage. But sometimes the damage occurs to one of these very regulatory genes itself. There are two main types of genes that act as the guardians of cellular order. The first are the proto-oncogenes. These are the genes that act like the accelerator pedal in a car, encouraging the cell to grow and divide. When a proto-oncogene is mutated, it can become an oncogene, an accelerator pedal that is stuck in the on position. The cell receives a constant, unrelenting signal to grow, grow, grow. The second type of guardian genes are the tumor suppressor genes. These are the brakes. They are the genes that tell the cell to stop dividing, or that inspect the DNA for damage, and if the damage is too severe to be repaired, they are the ones that give the command for the cell to undergo apoptosis. When a tumor suppressor gene is mutated, the brakes fail. The cell loses its ability to stop dividing, and it also loses its ability to die when it is supposed to. Cancer is not caused by a single mutation. It is a multi-step process, a slow, gradual accumulation of damage over many years. A single cell might acquire a mutation in a proto-oncogene, causing it to divide a little more than it should. This creates a small, benign growth, a polyp or a mole. Most of these will never progress further. But within this growing population of cells, there is now a greater chance that one of them will acquire a second mutation, perhaps in a tumor suppressor gene. Now this cell has both a stuck accelerator and broken brakes. It begins to divide even more rapidly and uncontrollably. As the tumour grows, its cells continue to mutate, acquiring new and more dangerous abilities. They learn to attract their own blood supply, a process called angiogenesis, to feed their relentless growth. They learn to evade the immune system, which would normally recognise and destroy such abnormal cells. They lose their physical adhesion to their neighbours, allowing them to break away from the primary tumour. And finally, they can acquire the ability to metastasize, to invade the bloodstream or the lymphatic system, to travel to distant parts of the body, and to set up new colonies, new tumours, in vital organs like the lungs, the liver or the brain. It is this final, metastatic stage that is responsible for the vast majority of cancer deaths. To look at a cancer cell under a microscope is to see a cell that has reverted to a more primitive, selfish and almost single-celled existence. It has forgotten that it is part of a larger cooperative society. Its only goal is its own, immortal survival and proliferation. It is, in a sense, evolution in a bottle. Within the ecosystem of the body, the cancer cells are constantly competing, mutating and evolving, with the most aggressive, most resilient and most metastatic cells being the ones that survive and take over. The tumour is a chaotic, heterogeneous and constantly changing population of rebel cells. This understanding of cancer as a genetic, cellular and evolutionary disease has completely transformed our approach to treating it. For centuries, the only effective treatment for cancer was surgery, to physically cut out the rebellious tissue. This is still a cornerstone of cancer treatment, but it is only effective if the disease is caught before it has spread. In the 20th century, two new, powerful but blunt instruments were added to the arsenal: radiation therapy and chemotherapy. Radiation uses high-energy beams to shred the DNA of cancer cells, destroying their ability to divide. Chemotherapy uses powerful cytotoxic drugs that circulate throughout the body and are designed to kill any rapidly dividing cell. Both of these treatments are effective, but they are not specific. They are forms of carpet bombing that cause significant collateral damage to the body's own healthy, rapidly dividing cells, such as those in the hair follicles, the digestive tract, and the bone marrow, leading to the familiar and debilitating side effects of hair loss, nausea, and immune suppression. The future of cancer treatment, and a future that is already beginning to arrive, lies in a much more intelligent and targeted approach, one that is based on our deep understanding of the specific genetic mutations that are driving a particular patient's cancer. This is the world of precision medicine. Instead of just asking, what organ does this cancer come from? We now ask, what specific mutations are making this cancer grow? By sequencing the DNA of a patient's tumour, we can identify its specific genetic weaknesses, its Achilles heel. We can then use targeted therapy drugs that are designed to block the specific, malfunctioning protein that is being produced by a particular oncogene. These drugs can be far more effective and far less toxic than traditional chemotherapy. Even more exciting is the dawn of cancer immunotherapy, a revolutionary approach that does not target the cancer cell directly, but instead reawakens the power of the patient's own immune system. Cancer cells often learn to produce signals that effectively put the brakes on the immune system, making themselves invisible to the body's own defenses. Immunotherapy drugs, known as checkpoint inhibitors, are designed to block these signals. They release the brakes on the immune system, allowing the body's own T cells to recognize the cancer cells as the enemy they are, and to mount a powerful and effective attack. We are, in essence, teaching the body's own army how to fight the rebellion. To contemplate cancer is to meditate on the profound fragility of our own multicellular existence. It is a reminder that the order and cooperation that we take for granted is a constant, active process, a delicate balance that can be disrupted. It is a disease that arises from our own biology, a bug in our own source code. But our growing understanding of its cellular and genetic nature is giving us a new and powerful hope. We are learning to read the language of our cellular outlaws, to identify their weaknesses and to turn their own biology against them. The story of cancer is a story of a rebellion from within, but it is also becoming a story of our own, intelligent and increasingly successful counter-revolution. We have journeyed deep into the physical substance of the body, exploring the cells, the genes, and the molecules that govern our biological existence. But there is another, more ethereal, and perhaps more mysterious dimension to our being, the realm of the mind. Our consciousness, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, our very sense of self, these are the most intimate and immediate aspects of our reality. And so, when this inner world becomes a source of suffering, when our thoughts turn against us, when our emotions become unbearable, or when our perception of reality itself begins to fracture, we experience a unique and deeply frightening form of sickness. This is the story of mental illness, and it is the story of humanity's long, slow, and often painful journey to understand the most complex and enigmatic object in the known universe, the human brain. For most of human history, the mind, the soul, the consciousness, was seen as something separate from the physical body, a ghost in the machine. It was an immaterial, spiritual essence, a breath of the divine. Therefore, sickness of the mind was not seen as a medical problem, but as a spiritual or moral one. In the ancient world, madness was often seen as a form of divine punishment or possession, the work of angry gods or malevolent demons. The treatment was not medicine, but exorcism, prayer, and ritual, an attempt to appease the supernatural forces that had taken hold of the person's soul. In later centuries, this spiritual view was replaced by a moral one. Mental illness was seen as a sign of a weak character, a moral failing, a lack of willpower, or a result of sin. The mentally ill were not seen as sick, but as mad, lunatic, or insane. They were often feared, ridiculed, and ostracized. The places built to house them were not hospitals, but asylums. These were not places of healing, but places of confinement, designed primarily to protect society from the disruptive and unpredictable behavior of its mentally ill members. For centuries, the treatments offered in these institutions were often brutal and misguided, based on the idea that the patient needed to be shocked or disciplined back to a state of reason. Patients were subjected to ice water baths, to spinning chairs designed to induce dizziness and vomiting, to solitary confinement in dark cells, and to physical restraints like straitjackets. The goal was not to understand or to heal the patient's inner world, but to control their outer behavior. The mind remained a black box, and its illnesses were a source of profound shame and stigma. The first great revolution in our understanding of mental illness began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the work of Sigmund Freud and the birth of psychoanalysis. Freud proposed a radical new idea, that our conscious thoughts and actions are driven by a vast, hidden, and powerful unconscious mind, a realm of repressed desires, forgotten memories, and unresolved childhood conflicts. Mental illness, in this view, was the result of these unconscious conflicts breaking through and disrupting the conscious mind. The talking cure of psychoanalysis was a new kind of healing. It was a patient, introspective journey, a form of psychological archaeology in which the patient, guided by the analyst, would attempt to excavate their own unconscious mind, to bring these hidden conflicts to light and to resolve them. Psychoanalysis was a monumental shift. It treated the patient's inner world with a new seriousness and respect. It acknowledged that the suffering of the mentally ill was real and had a cause, even if that cause was hidden in the depths of their own psyche. It replaced the moral judgment of the asylum with the quiet, non-judgmental listening of the analyst's office. But it was still a science of the ghost. It treated the mind as a purely psychological entity, largely disconnected from the physical, biological reality of the brain. The second, and perhaps more profound revolution began in the middle of the 20th century, and it is a revolution that is still very much underway. This was the dawn of the biological era of psychiatry, the beginning of our understanding of mental illness not as a spiritual failing or a psychological conflict, but as a disease of the brain. This shift was driven by a series of discoveries that began to reveal the intricate physical and chemical machinery of the mind itself. The first major breakthrough was the accidental discovery of the first effective psychiatric medications. In the 1950s, drugs that had been developed for other purposes, such as antihistamines or anesthetics, were observed to have powerful and unexpected effects on the symptoms of psychosis and depression. The first antipsychotic, chlorpromazine, was found to be remarkably effective at reducing the hallucinations and delusions of schizophrenia. The first antidepressants were found to lift the profound, crushing sadness of major depression. These discoveries were revolutionary. They were the first tangible proof that the complex states of our minds, our moods, our thoughts, our perceptions, were directly tied to the chemical processes of our brains. This led to an explosion of research in the new field of neuroscience. Scientists began to map the intricate wiring of the brain, the trillions of connections between its billions of nerve cells or neurons, and they began to understand the language that these neurons use to communicate with each other. This is a language not of thoughts or ideas, but of chemistry. Neurons communicate by releasing tiny chemical messengers, called neurotransmitters, into the microscopic gap, the synapse, that separates one neuron from the next. These neurotransmitters, chemicals with names like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, are the fundamental currency of thought and emotion. This gave rise to the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. The symptoms of depression, for example, were proposed to be caused by a deficiency of serotonin in the brain. The symptoms of schizophrenia were linked to an excess of dopamine. This theory, while likely an oversimplification, was incredibly powerful. It provided a clear biological model for understanding mental illness, and it led to the development of a new generation of psychiatric drugs, like the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are designed to correct these presumed chemical imbalances. For millions of people, these medications have been life-saving, lifting the fog of depression, quieting the voices of psychosis, and calming the storm of anxiety. They are the chemical tools that have allowed us to begin to repair the malfunctioning machinery of the mind. More recently, our tools for studying the brain have become even more powerful. Technologies like fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and PET, positron emission tomography, scans allow us to watch the living brain in action. We can see which parts of the brain become active when we feel happy, or sad, or afraid. We can compare the brain activity of a healthy person to that of a person with a mental illness. This has revealed that mental illness is not just a matter of a simple chemical imbalance, but is often associated with more complex, large-scale changes in the brain's structure and function. We can see differences in the size of certain brain regions, or in the way different regions communicate with each other in large-scale neural networks. We are beginning to see the physical scars of mental illness in the brain itself. To contemplate the modern science of the mind is to witness the slow, patient, and final dissolution of the ghost in the machine. We are coming to understand that the mind is not separate from the brain. The mind is what the brain does. Our consciousness, our emotions, our very sense of self, are the emergent properties of the brain's intricate electrochemical dance. This is a profound and sometimes unsettling realization, but it is also a deeply hopeful and compassionate one. It means that mental illness is not a moral failing or a weakness of character. It is a biological disease, just like diabetes or heart disease. The person who is suffering from depression or schizophrenia is no more to blame for their condition than a person who is suffering from cancer. This understanding is the most powerful antidote to the shame and stigma that have surrounded mental illness for millennia. It allows us to approach the suffering of the mind with the same empathy, the same scientific rigor, and the same determination to heal that we apply to the diseases of the body. The journey into the science of the mind is far from over. The brain is still, in many ways, a vast and mysterious continent. But we have begun to draw the map. We have learned that the ghost is not a ghost at all. It is the beautiful, complex, and sometimes fragile music of the machine itself. Let us now return to the world of the very small, to the silent, constant, and incredibly violent battle that is being waged within our bodies at every moment of our lives. We have spoken of the germ theory, the identification of the microbial invaders that cause infectious disease. But this is only half of the story. The other half is the story of our defense. For every invading microbe, there is a defender. For every pathogen, there is a protector. This is the story of the immune system, the body's own personal army. It is a system of breathtaking complexity, of profound intelligence, and of ruthless efficiency. It is a vast, decentralized, and constantly learning network of cells, tissues, and molecules that stands as the guardian of our biological integrity. To contemplate the science of immunology is to witness a drama of surveillance, of recognition, of communication, and of warfare, all taking place on a microscopic scale. The immune system is not a single organ, like the heart or the liver. It is a diffuse and mobile army spread throughout the entire body. Its soldiers are the white blood cells, a diverse and specialized cast of characters, each with its own unique role in the defense of the realm. They are born in the bone marrow, they are educated in the thymus, and they patrol the body through the highways of the bloodstream and the lymphatic system, constantly searching for any sign of trouble. The first line of defense is the innate immune system. This is our ancient, hardwired and non-specific defense force. It is the system's first responders. Its soldiers include cells like the neutrophils, which are like the infantry, the most abundant type of white blood cell, which can quickly swarm to the site of an infection and engulf and digest invading bacteria. And there are the macrophages, the big eaters, which act as the sentinels and the garbage collectors, patrolling the tissues, swallowing cellular debris, and engulfing any foreign invaders they encounter. The innate immune system is fast and furious. It recognizes broad general patterns that are common to many pathogens, and it launches an immediate all-out assault. This assault is what we experience as inflammation, the redness, the swelling, the heat, and the pain at the site of a cut or an infection. It is the sign of a battle in progress. But the true genius of our defense lies in the second line, the adaptive immune system. This is a more recent evolutionary innovation, and it is a system of incredible specificity, power, and memory. It is the special forces of our immune army, and its two main protagonists are the T cells and the B cells. The adaptive immune system can learn to recognize and target a specific, individual pathogen, and it can remember that pathogen for years, or even for a lifetime, providing long-term immunity. The story begins when a sentinel cell, like a macrophage, engulfs an invading bacterium. It digests the bacterium and then takes a small piece of it, a molecular fragment called an antigen, and displays it on its own surface, like a captured enemy flag. This macrophage then travels through the lymphatic system to a nearby lymph node, which acts as a military command center. In the lymph node, the macrophage presents the captured antigen to a specific type of T cell, known as a helper T cell. There are millions of different helper T cells circulating in the body, each one with a unique receptor on its surface, each one tuned to recognize a different specific antigen. When the macrophage finds the one helper T cell out of millions that has the perfectly matching receptor for the antigen it's carrying, a connection is made. The helper T cell is activated. This moment of activation is the spark that ignites the entire adaptive immune response. The activated helper T cell begins to divide rapidly, creating an army of clones of itself. It also begins to act as the general of the army, sending out chemical signals called cytokines that orchestrate the entire battle plan. Some of these signals will activate the B cells. B cells are the body's weapons factories. When a B cell with a matching receptor encounters the antigen and receives the activation signal from a helper T cell, it begins to transform. It becomes a plasma cell, a microscopic factory dedicated to producing a single product: antibodies. Antibodies are one of the most elegant and powerful weapons in the immune arsenal. They are small, Y-shaped proteins that are custom designed to bind to one and only one specific antigen. The plasma cells pump out millions of these antibodies into the bloodstream. These antibodies then circulate throughout the body, and when they encounter the invading bacteria, they latch onto them. The antibodies do not kill the bacteria directly. Instead, they act as tags, as markers. They paint the invaders, making them irresistible targets for the macrophages and other phagocytic cells, which can now easily recognize and devour them. They also activate another part of the immune system called the complement system, a cascade of proteins that can punch holes in the bacterial cell wall, causing it to burst. At the same time, the helper T cells are also activating another type of T cell, the killer T cell, or cytotoxic T lymphocyte. These are the assassins of the immune system. Their primary job is not to fight bacteria in the open, but to hunt down and destroy the body's own cells that have been compromised. If a virus has infected a cell, that cell will display fragments of the viral proteins on its surface. The killer T cells are trained to recognize these signs of internal betrayal. When a killer T cell finds a virus-infected cell, it latches on and delivers a kiss of death, a payload of toxic chemicals that instructs the infected cell to undergo apoptosis, to commit suicide, destroying the viral replication factory within. After the battle has been won and the infection has been cleared, the immune response needs to be shut down. A third type of T cell, the regulatory T cell, steps in to suppress the activity of the other immune cells, preventing them from causing unnecessary damage to the body's own tissues. But the story does not end there. A small number of the activated T cells and B cells do not die off. They remain as memory cells. These are the veterans of the war. They can circulate in the body for years, or even for a lifetime, carrying the memory of the specific pathogen they have fought. If that same pathogen ever tries to invade the body again, these memory cells will recognize it immediately and launch a response that is so fast and so powerful that the invader is eliminated before it can even cause any symptoms. This is the basis of long-term immunity. It is why you usually only get diseases like chickenpox once. The science of immunology has given us one of the most powerful tools in the history of medicine: vaccination. A vaccine is, in essence, a way of training our immune system without having to get sick. It works by introducing a safe, harmless version of a pathogen, a killed virus, a weakened bacterium, or just a small, purified piece of its antigen, into the body. The immune system sees this harmless mimic as a real threat and mounts a full adaptive immune response. It creates an army of antibodies, and most importantly, it creates a population of memory cells. The body is now primed. If it ever encounters the real dangerous pathogen in the future, its immune system will be ready, and it will be able to mount an immediate and overwhelming defense. Vaccination is not a drug that cures a disease. It is a teacher that educates our own personal army, giving it the knowledge and the memory it needs to protect us from future harm. To contemplate the immune system is to be filled with a sense of awe at the sheer, mind-boggling complexity and intelligence of our own biology. It is a system that can distinguish, with near-perfect accuracy, between self and other. It is a system that can learn, that can remember, and that can adapt to an almost infinite variety of threats. It is a silent, tireless, and powerful guardian, a beautiful and violent dance of cells and molecules that is the very reason we are able to survive in a world that is teeming with invisible dangers. The story of immunology is the story of our own inner army, the beautiful, intricate, and powerful system that keeps us safe. Pain is the most universal of all human sicknesses. It is more than just a physical sensation. It is a profound and deeply personal experience that can overwhelm our consciousness, shatter our will, and drain the colour from our world. It is the body's primal alarm system, an ancient and essential biological mechanism designed to alert us to injury and to protect us from further harm. But when pain becomes chronic, when the alarm bell continues to ring long after the danger has passed, it ceases to be a useful signal and becomes a disease in itself. The story of our relationship with pain is a story of a long and often desperate search for relief, a quest for a way to silence the alarm. It is a journey that has taken us from the magical juices of a humble flower to the deep, hidden chemistry of our own brains, revealing that the power to control pain lies not just in the pharmacy, but within ourselves. Our story begins, as so many stories of medicine do, with a plant. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, is a plant with a long and storied history. For at least 6,000 years, humans have known that the milky latex that seeps from the unripe seed pod of this flower has a remarkable and powerful effect. When dried, this latex becomes opium, a substance with an almost magical ability to relieve pain, to induce a state of euphoric calm, and to bring on a deep, dream-filled sleep. In ancient Sumeria, it was known as Hulgil, the joy plant. The ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all used opium as their most powerful analgesic, their most effective tool against suffering. The Greek physician Galen called it a panacea, a cure for all ills. For millennia, opium in its various forms was the undisputed king of painkillers, the most potent weapon humanity had in its long and often losing war against pain. For centuries, the use of opium was a craft, not a science. It was prepared as a crude extract, often dissolved in alcohol to create a tincture called laudanum. The dosage was imprecise, and the effects could be unpredictable. The same substance that offered blessed relief from the agony of a surgical operation, or the chronic pain of a disease, could also, in a slightly higher dose, lead to respiratory depression and death. And it held a darker magic as well, the power of addiction. The same euphoric calm that made it so effective against pain could also create a powerful psychological craving, a dependence that could trap the user in a cycle of escalating use and devastating withdrawal. The first step towards understanding the science of opium came in the early 19th century. In 1804, a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner performed a series of daring and brilliant chemical experiments. He succeeded in isolating the pure active chemical compound from crude opium He had found the source of its power. It was a crystalline alkaline substance, an alkaloid, and he named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was a landmark moment in the history of medicine. It was the first time that the active ingredient of a medicinal plant had ever been isolated. It transformed pharmacology from a craft of plant lore into a science of pure chemicals. The isolation of morphine, and later of other opium alkaloids like codeine, gave doctors a new and powerful tool. They could now administer a precise known dose of the drug, making its effects more reliable and, in theory, safer. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s allowed for the direct injection of morphine, providing even faster and more potent pain relief. Morphine became the gold standard of analgesia, an essential tool on the battlefield and in the hospital, but its purity also amplified its dark side. The potent, rapid relief offered by injected morphine also came with an even higher risk of addiction. The search continued for a safe opiate, a drug that could provide the pain relief of morphine without its addictive potential. This search led, in the late 19th century, to a tragic and ironic misstep. A chemist working for the Bayer company in Germany modified the morphine molecule, creating a new semi-synthetic compound called diacetylmorphine. It was found to be even more potent than morphine, and it was initially believed to be non-addictive. Bayer marketed it as a cough suppressant and a heroic new painkiller. They called it heroin. The tragic error of this assumption would not become clear for many years. For over a century, the way that morphine and other opiates worked their magic on the brain remained a complete mystery. They were a key that seemed to fit a lock somewhere in the nervous system, but the nature of that lock was unknown. The breakthrough came in the early 1970s. Using new techniques, scientists were able to label opiate molecules with radioactive tags and track where they went in the brain. They discovered that these molecules were not just acting in a general diffuse way. They were binding to specific physical sites, to specific protein molecules on the surface of neurons. These were the opiate receptors. The lock had been found. This discovery immediately raised a profound and tantalizing question. Why would the human brain evolve a specific, dedicated receptor for a chemical found in a plant? It seemed highly unlikely. The only logical explanation was that the brain must produce its own, internal, morphine-like chemicals, its own natural painkillers, that were designed to fit these receptors. The opiate receptors were not there for the poppy. They were there for the body's own endogenous opiates. The race was on to find these mysterious internal painkillers. In 1975, two separate teams of researchers in Scotland and the United States succeeded. They isolated a pair of small protein fragments or peptides from the brains of pigs and calves that bound to the opiate receptors and had powerful pain-relieving effects. They named them enkephalins, from the Greek for in the head. Shortly thereafter, other, even more powerful, endogenous opiates were discovered, including the famous endorphins, a name that is a contraction of endogenous morphine. This was a discovery of profound importance. It revealed that the body has its own, built-in natural system for controlling pain. The brain is not just a passive receiver of pain signals, it is an active modulator. It can send signals down the spinal cord to block or dampen incoming pain signals from the body. The endorphin system is a key part of this descending pain control network. When we are under great stress or experience a serious injury, the brain can release these natural opiates, producing a state of stress-induced analgesia. This is the phenomenon that allows a wounded soldier on the battlefield or an athlete in the heat of a game to continue to function, seemingly unaware of a severe injury. The discovery of the endorphin system also helped to explain the powerful, pain-relieving effects of things that had long been a mystery. It helped to explain the placebo effect, how a simple sugar pill can produce real, physiological pain relief if the person believes it is a powerful painkiller. The act of belief itself can trigger the release of the body's own endorphins. It also provided a potential explanation for the analgesic effects of practices like acupuncture. The insertion of the needles may stimulate nerves that trigger the release of endorphins in the brain and spinal cord. The modern war on pain is now being fought on two fronts. On one front, we continue to develop more sophisticated synthetic opioid drugs, trying to design molecules that can provide powerful pain relief while minimizing the risk of addiction and other side effects. We are trying to create smarter bullets that can target specific subtypes of the opiate receptor, separating the desired analgesic effects from the unwanted euphoric and addictive ones. On the other front, we're learning how to harness the power of the body's own internal pharmacy. We're exploring non-pharmacological ways to boost our natural endorphin system. We know that vigorous aerobic exercise can trigger an endorphin rush, the so-called runner's high. We know that practices like meditation, mindfulness, and cognitive behavioral therapy can help people to change their relationship with their pain, to modulate their own perception of it, likely by engaging these same descending pain control pathways. We are learning that the mind is not just a passive victim of pain, but a powerful tool in its management. To contemplate the long history of our war on pain is to see a journey that has taken us from the magic of a flower to the intricate neurochemistry of our own brains. It is a story that reminds us of the double-edged nature of our most powerful medicines, their capacity for both profound healing and profound harm. And it is a story that ultimately reveals a deep and hopeful truth, that the power to endure, to modulate, and to overcome suffering is not just something we find in a pill or a syringe. It is a power that is written into our own biology, a quiet, resilient, and deeply personal strength that resides within the hidden, chemical pathways of our own minds.